The headline suggests a moment of political embarrassment, a single lawmaker caught off guard by an inconvenient filing from the Department of Justice. It sounds dramatic, perhaps even sensational, but the truth is far more sobering because what unfolded this week was not a typical Washington miscalculation, nor the usual spectacle of partisan distress. It was something older, more structural, and more revealing. The moment an institution, one that had long tolerated a certain elastic relationship with legality, quietly signaled that the elasticity had reached its limit. And that signal did not merely embarrass a politician, it exposed a pattern the political class hoped would remain buried beneath talking points and friendly media framing. The headlines treat this as a misstep. In reality, it is the consequence of years of accumulated impunity. And that's where this story actually begins. What the public witnessed this week was presented as a routine procedural update, a filing, a clarification, a technical adjustment in language. But beneath the sterile bureaucratic phrasing, the document performed a very different function. It established intent, it reconstructed preparation, and most importantly, it illuminated coordination where many insisted none existed. The lawmaker's earlier statements, delivered with the confidence of someone accustomed to narrative immunity, were abruptly contradicted not by political opponents, but by the one institution that typically avoids such entanglements: the DOJ's own internal record. This filing did not discover new information. It did not accidentally surface. It was a controlled release of what had been known for far longer than the public timeline suggests. And that precision, the timing, the framing, the unmistakable tone, made clear that what we are seeing is not an impulsive bureaucratic action, but the first stage of institutional repositioning. This document was not designed to inform. It was designed to signal. For years, commentators have tried to portray these moments as mere political skirmishes, partisan jousting with no lasting consequence. But the DOJ, unlike media surrogates, does not operate on the cadence of cable news. Its language is colder, drier, and far more consequential. This is where lines matter. Not ideological lines, but institutional ones, the kind that determine the legitimacy of governance itself. When a lawmaker attempts to blur those boundaries, to insert their own political imperatives into processes meant to remain insulated from them, the institution eventually must respond. This is not theoretical. Institutions cannot long endure if elected officials assume they may shape oversight, pressure prosecutors, or pre-narrate investigations with the expectation of media indulgence. The filing was, in essence, a reminder that the chain of command exists, and that even Washington's most privileged figures do not sit above it. Yet the most revealing part of this episode was not the filing itself, but whom it struck. The lawmaker in question was not a fringe figure, not an inexperienced newcomer who misread the temperature of the moment. They were someone deeply enmeshed in the party's legal messaging apparatus, someone who, for years, was treated as a reliable validator of institutional respectability. And that status, ironically, made the blowback worse. Because when an institution pushes back against someone with credentials, with seniority, with committee access, the message changes. It becomes a declaration that what occurred was not permissible error, but prohibited conduct. Others have made similar statements. Others have attempted similar political maneuvers. But this individual occupied a position that demanded caution. Instead, they assumed protection. And that assumption has now collapsed into formal consequence. When the DOJ responded, it did so not with outrage, not with rhetoric, but with something far more ominous, precise, bureaucratic language. There were references to improper inference, unsupported characterization, and extrajudicial commentary, inconsistent with departmental norms. These are not the phrases of political rebuke. They are quiet warnings, signs that an institution is reclaiming territory once ceded for political convenience. Contrast this with the media's framing, which emphasize feeling, misunderstandings, and supposed miscommunication. Institutions do not speak in emotion. They speak in responsibility. and the shift was unmistakable. Power moved away from the lawmaker and back toward the agency whose patience had been tested one time too many. The public response from the lawmaker was telling: a sudden acceleration of social media posts, an insistence on personal virtue, the invocation of past service, committee assignments, and proximity to leadership, a resume-based attempt to substitute personal narrative for procedural accountability. The tone carried the unmistakable echo of fear, a belief that the public might confuse confidence with innocence or volume with authority. But institutions do not respond to tone. They respond to conduct, and the defensive posture, the over-curated indignation, revealed a political figure suddenly aware that their usual shields, media allies, sympathetic commentators, selective leaks, were no longer sufficient. Predictably friendly outlets moved quickly to soften the edges. They reframed the moment as an overreaction, recast the filing as ambiguous, and portrayed the lawmaker as a victim of complexity rather than agency. Emotion replaced accountability. Sympathy replaced analysis. But the problem with this approach is simple. Institutional documents do not bend to narrative. They remain in the record indifferent to sentiment and immune to partisan framing, and the public, increasingly aware of the widening chasm between media storytelling and institutional reality, senses the dissonance. This episode is not isolated. It is part of a growing pattern in which political actors assume that institutions will tolerate nearly any degree of narrative manipulation, and that media partners will smooth out the rest. We have seen similar inflection points in recent years, when intelligence agencies resisted political pressure, when courts rejected overconfident legal theories, when inspectors general refused to sanitize reports. Each time, the political class blamed optics rather than conduct. But this moment feels different, because the breach came not from a rival but from an institution that had been largely differential until now. The pattern is unmistakable: an erosion of norms, an expectation of immunity, and the weaponization of narrative as a substitute for responsibility. Eventually, something breaks. So the question now is not whether this lawmaker will weather the news cycle. The question is whether this marks the beginning of a new institutional posture, a willingness by long silent bureaucratic entities to reassert boundaries and reject political manipulation. If this is such a moment, the implications extend far beyond a single filing. It would signal that the old assumption that certain individuals or parties enjoy unspoken exemptions is no longer operative. And if that is true, Washington may be facing a far more consequential recalibration than the pundits yet realize. In the end, what was meant to be a show of confidence, a preemptive narrative strike, has become something else entirely. The moment an institution answered back, the irony is stark. A lawmaker who believed they could shape the story instead became defined by it. What was intended as a protective maneuver has backfired into scrutiny, exposure, and a slow but unmistakable shift in power. And the quiet message delivered by the filing remains unresolved. Not triumphant, not punitive, merely cold and clear. There are limits, and Washington is about to learn where those limits truly lie.